Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC and is an honor and merit of Yosef Shlema ben Risha for a complete and speedy refuah shlema. We are close to the end of chapter 21 in Tanya, Perek Chaf Aleph, continuing the discussion of Achdus Hashem. Achdus Hashem, fundamental principle in Shema Yisrael, Hashem Echad in Judaism, and a fundamental foundation in Chassidus Bechlal, especially Chassidus Chabad, to ingrain within each of us that there only is God. The only true reality is godliness. And all of existence is really a dimension and a reflection of godliness. However, as we're learning and we'll continue learning, it's concealed, and our job is to reveal that. And why is this so vital in the context of what we're learning? Because Tanya is based on Korev Elecha Dover Me'ed Beficho B'Vovcha La'Seisei. Korev Elecha, as we've learned, is that it's accessible, that it's relevant, that it is part of our very lives. The question, however, is our lives. We live in a material world with many different agendas and many different preoccupations. So we're not 24/7 necessarily infused with godliness. So the Alter Rebbe is coming to explain, yes, we are. That's the truth. And it's our job to recognize that. So earlier in the Tanya, he spoke about Korev Elecha Dover Me'ed, how we achieve it through contemplation, Mamal Kalam, Sevu Kalam, and Kulamei Kamei Kalochashiv, to the point that it awakens, our contemplation awakens and gives birth to emotions of love of God and reverence of God. And that in turn gives you the power to control Moyach Shal Talev, control the animal soul, the different levels, and to what extent we're able to do so depending on the level of the Beinoni. But then, the Alter Rebbe in chapter 18 said, now let us discuss what about someone who cannot reach that level of contemplation. Even a contemplation, you also lay that it's the fitting thing, what he called talumas libe, not full-blown emotions, even the emotions that essentially we feel that would be appropriate to love God. You don't actually feel the love of God, but it's appropriate to do so. Even that he can't achieve. So there's the Ava Mesoteres, the innate love within each soul that connects that soul to God. However, that remains concealed. Ava Mesoteres. And it's only in a time of challenge and a soyin, when that Jew, even a simple Jew, is posed with a challenge. Either worship idolatry or God, that's when it reveals that he would b'shum eifin not in any way betray God. But that's under such dire circumstances. What about the rest of the time? So the Alter Rebbe is explaining that in truth, everything is included in Achdus Hashem and its antithesis, which is the opposite of not having any false gods. In the words of the Aseret HaDibros, Anochi v'lo yeh lecha. Everything is included in there. So these chapters are explaining the concept, the theology behind that. Because all of existence, he explained in chapter 20, is completely insignificant, and therefore there's no change within God between before existence and after. It's so insignificant. It's like one word compared to the infinite amount of words we can utter, even more so compared to thought, even more so compared to the faculties in the soul. That's even on a human level. And in chapter 21, he said it's even furthermore. Our dibur is unlike God's dibur. His speech is not even outside of him. So even when he expresses himself and creates the world through Asara Mamoris, B'dvar Hashem, that dibur is one with him. Unlike a human being who speaks, and that speaking can be heard by others, there's an element of duality in some form. Whereas by God, there's no such thing altogether. So all of existence is really all part of God's energy. So then, of course, the question arises, so then why don't we feel that? So the reason we don't feel it, because that's the kavanah, is we should overcome that, not feeling it, and come to feel it. So the Alter Rebbe introduces the concept of tzimtzum. And that's what we learned in the last class. That even though there's this tachlis hayichud b'mhus v'atzmusei, gam acher sheyotze diburi yizbarach el apel b'brias elemis, k'moy shehoya miyuchad imay kedem brias elemis, ve'en shum shini klal l'fanif yizbarach. In other words, the unity is not just within the divine consciousness. It's the divine consciousness even as it relates to existence. So then comes the question, what about us? Why do we feel we're separate? And we can't say it's an illusion, because Bereshis bara l'kimus hashamayim v'aretz, God created a world. And He created us not to feel that divine presence and consciousness. So He said, that's Ella el habruim amakablim chayusim b'chinas deburi yizbarach. But those that receive their vitality from diburi yizbarach, from God's speech, b'chinas yitziyase kvar el apel b'brias elemis, in a state where it's so-called merging in the process of creation, is an actual creation. So from God's point of view, the creation is all part of His divine unity. But from our perspective, it's in a form of Yitziyasi. We sense an element that it's emerged. Why? Because the Chayes shemislabish b'hem lachyesim ha'idei shtalshus me'ila la'ol. Because the way God expresses Himself, and that's why it's called speech, becomes embedded in giving every aspect of existence life in a way that is bepnimius and mislabish behem. Through ishtalshlus me'ila le'ila. Me'ila la'ala, I should say. By, so to speak, rung by rung, stage by stage, step by step. That's why it's called the ishtalshlus, ishtal like a shalshelis, where each link of the chain is linked to another link in the chain, and that's a process that goes step by step. Me'ila la'olol, cause to effect, cause and effect. So it's not just that it goes from chain to chain, but it's a cause and effect. That's how the achayis is mislabish. B'tzimtzumim rabim v'shenim, through numerous and diverse diminishments. So numerous would be different, many tzimtzumim. Like a teacher who's teaching an idea to different students, so there's many different levels of diminishment according to the student. And there's also different quality level of tzimtzum, shenim, different types of tzimtzum. A more intense one, a less intense one. So there's a number of them, as well as different types. To the point that this divine consciousness, the creations are able to receive their life force and creative energy without their identity being annihilated. Because that's key here. He wants an existence. And a real existence. So how do you reconcile that? So these are the tzimtzumim. And now he explains what these tzimtzumim are, how they affect us, and how they affect, or don't affect the divine, I should say. So what does he continue saying? All these diminishments are what we call the hiding of the face. Hester ponim, hiding of God's face. Lahastiru lahailim ha'ir v'achayis hanimshach midiburi yizbarach. The process of hiding and concealing or obscuring the light and life energy which comes from God's speech. So now we're introducing another power of God's. We'll soon learn more detail about it. It's not a concealment because we don't see it. That's the result. It's not a concealment from some other force, God forbid. God Himself is employing another power of His, the power to conceal. So it should not be overly revealed in a way that the lower worlds cannot contain them. Going back to the analogy, it's only an analogy because a teacher doesn't create a student. But he conceals all the brilliance in order for the student to be able to receive without being overwhelmed. So in other words, it's critical that they have independent consciousness, independence, but it's also, as we're going to learn, doesn't affect in any way the concealer, the one who's doing the concealing. In other words, is God. But what you see now is that there's something active that's actually creating a thing we call speech. So in human speech, it's actually a speech that speaks so-called to someone else outside you. With God and existence, there's nothing outside of him, like we learned. However, there is a force that conceals, that makes us perceive that we're outside of him. Ulechein, gam ken nidme lahem. So just as God did, what did he do? He concealed, like he said, the energy, so it should not be overly revealed, so the world cannot, to in any way that would limit the world from containing that energy and giving them life, would not overwhelm them. That's why it also appears to the creations that this very dibur and the energy that's flowing from the divine, that's malubish behem, like we said. If it was not malubish behem, it was in a form of makif, so you could say it's removed. But here it is manifesting within them. Yehi oyer, let there be light. Yehi rekia, let there be a firmament. Teitziaris desha, let there be plants. Yehi ma'eris, the luminaries in heaven. So these are all specific creations, each one with their unique characteristics and personality. So it's malubish behem, and so it appears to them ki'ilu davar mivdal mohus v'atzmus baruch, as if it were something separate from the blessed, from the divine core. Rak shenimshach mimenu yizbarach. It appears to them k'may dibur shel adam menafshe, as if the energy is being drawn out of him, just like human speech. That's why it's called dibur. Because you could say, one second, if we're saying God's dibur is not like our dibur, just like his thought is not like our thought, so his dibur is like his thought. It's united with him, completely part of him, as we learned earlier. So why do we call it dibur? Because it does appear to us as dibur, not like machshava. So to speak, hypothetically, if we were living in the world of God's thought, we would be more aware of that connection between the person who's thinking and his thought. But dibur does express itself in the human context as something outside of the human. So that's how it appears to us. But it's all about our appearance to us. It doesn't mean it's an illusion, because God is employing a concealment, a real concealment that actually has this impact. So there's a reality to it. But as soon learned, that reality does not affect God himself. But it does affect how existence experiences itself. Okay, so what we've introduced now is not just that existence is part of God's divine unity and reality, but also explaining then how do we reconcile that with our experience, that we don't feel it. Actually, we feel the opposite. Now, of course, through Arta contemplation and our Veda, the goal is that we should, but it takes Aveda. So even though Eineid Malvade is the true reality, but it's not our hergish, it's not our natural feeling. We have to work on it all the time. Well, Osid Lavi, once the work has been done, and we refine the world to the point that the world is completely aligned with the divine unity, then it'll be and the different expressions, V'nigel k'ved Hashem v'rol kol basar yachdov, ayin b'ayin yiro, v'lo yikonafed merecha v'yisas, and it'll be that we'll see v'hayenecha reisas merecha v'lo yikonafed merecha v'hayenecha reisas merecha. We'll see the teacher without any, the master we'll see without any concealments, without any garments. Different verses he brings in chapter 36 in Tanya. But that's l'asad lavi. And that's through work, through effort. Today, that's not how we see things. So now we've explained the so-called theology, the mechanics of why, because of tzimtzum. And the tzimtzum, however, is a reality. As I said, it's not a delusion or an illusion. Not a chizus einayim, as Chizis explains. And here comes now the other side. And at the same time, legab HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ein shum tzimtzum v'hester v'helam master amaylam lefonov. For from God's perspective, there has been no diminishment, hiding or concealment that would in any way cover or conceal anything in his presence. Like the teacher. Even when the teacher is diminishing his flow in order for the student to be able to receive it, and lo yizbatlu mitziyusim, shall not be annihilated, not be overwhelmed. But from the teacher's point of view, what is any diminishment? He's not become less brilliant. He doesn't understand the idea less. So l'gabi kodesh baruch hu ein shum tzimtzum v'hester klal. Ukechashecha ka'era. It brings a pasuk in Tehillim, Kuf Lamed Tes Yud Beis 139:12. Kuchashecha ka'era. For him, but to him, darkness is the same as light. And here he doesn't just mean darkness and light like night and day, but darkness as in divine concealment and divine revelation. Kediksiv gam cheshech leyachshech mimach. As the very verse, that same verse states, even the darkness does not obscure you. So that's from God's perspective. Mishum, and what's the reason for that? Mishum she'ena tzimtzumim v'alavushim, because the tzimtzumim and the levushim, the diminishments and the garments, you could say the filters, that which in a sense conceals the light, they're not separate from him. Chaz v'shalom, God forbid. So now, interesting. It's not just saying because God sees through the darkness. Because you could say it doesn't affect him because, like this teacher, the teacher is not affected by the diminishment that he's providing for the sake of the student. Doesn't affect him. He's saying furthermore, because the very concealment is also not separate from him. Because he's the one that's doing the concealing. So it's even deeper in that sense. So in a paradoxical way, the concealment is part of the divine unity. It's just in the form of concealment. But it's also part of the divine. And he gives for this an example from Medrash, which is brought in certain places in Kabbalah and Chassidus. Elikadein kamtsa de levushe menei bay. They are like kamtsa. There's different commentaries that explain it. Some explain it as a certain type of grasshopper or insect. Usually the translation is snail. There's different svarim that talk about this. And I'll give you the sources. In Matnas Kuna, Medrash Rabbah, where this example is brought, Bereshis Rabbah Parsha Chav Aleph, so he translated as chagov, which is chagovim, like a insect, a grasshopper. And Sefer Aruch HaSholem gives a different types of translations. What is kamsa? Very often it's interpreted as like a snail. But regardless, it's an animal. The garment is part of its body. So like when we put on a garment, the jacket is not part of your body. It's not part of your skeleton. It's an outside element. But there are animals, a turtle would be another example. A snail, with a garment, its shell is part of its body. So it has a body, but it has a shell, but the shell is part of its body. The shell is not an outside element. So this is an example. What's the example? That the divine energy, the energy is like, in this case, the body. The concealment is part of him. That's part of who he is. It's part of God, the godly manifestation. So it's not like there's the God, the revelation, and there's another force that would immediately imply duality. That's a concealer. No, the concealment is itself part of the divine energy. And now to really make it clear, because you could say, okay, but maybe these are two different levels of divine energy. They are indeed. But fundamentally, Kamoisha Kosuv ki Hashem hu Elikim. Like the Pasuk says in the verse in Parshat Veschanon, Daled Lametes, that Hashem hu Elikim. Hashem, Shem Havaya is the name of Gili. Elikim is Din, Tzimtzum. And Hashem hu Elikim, it's the same thing, it's one thing. It's one God, who has two tracks, so to speak. Like he explains Takan Shai Yichud V'Amuna, second section of Tanya, chapter 6. So what do we see from this? In addition to the fact that Tzimtzum and concealment doesn't affect him, that Tzimtzum itself is part of what God himself is employing. And therefore it's all part of the divine unity. From our point of view, concealment, from the student's point of view, the concealment, so we're only receiving in a conscious way. We're not talking about what's in Be'etzem. Fundamentally, in a conscious way, we're only receiving a certain diminished flow. And thus, it's a form of dibur, speech, that's tailored to the creation, and we feel ourselves as independent consciousness. But from God's point of view, all this doesn't apply. The darkness does not darken before him, because it's all part of his own power. It's his power, the power of Tzimtzum, which is one, Hashem, hu Elikim. Ulechein, kamei kelo choshev mamish. Kula kalo choshev mamish. And that is why in his presence, everything is considered completely nullified. Kelo, kemoi loy. That's what kelo means. And mamish. Not just like he's explained in chapter 20, that it's nullified and insignificant, like one letter compared to the infinite amount of letters. One drop of water compared to an entire ocean, even if we were to assume the ocean was infinite. One number compared to the infinite set of numbers. There, it's truly nullified, but it's not mamish kala. Here it's kala mamish. And for all the above reasons. First of all, everything God emanates from God is all one with him and doesn't change at all. The shift and change is only from our perspective, but that does not affect God's perspective, because the Tzimtzum itself is part of his own expression. It's like the same God that is revealing is choosing now not to reveal. So this is in addition to the fact that in Elikim you see his connection to Havaya, but more than that, Elikim itself is a divine expression. Or in the language of Shai Yichud V'Amuna, hein gvureisav. So when you ask the question, is existence as an independent reality real or not real? It's real because the Tzimtzum is real. But since God is the one that is actually doing the Tzimtzum, so that, number one, gives it more reality. It's God's Tzimtzum, like he says in the end of chapter 4 in Shai Yichud V'Amuna, and the Rebbe explains it at length in a Sikha in Shabbos Parsha Mishpatim Tavshech Chav Zayin. Tzimtzum nikra kelim. The Tzimtzum itself is called kelim. Kelim is substance. Kelim is not just the absence of light. There's a reality that God employed called Tzimtzum. It's a true, powerful reality. But is it a concealment? That's where there's a difference. From our point of view, it's a concealment. From God's point of view, it's another form of God's energy. It's an energy, inverted energy, if you wish. So now we have a whole other take on existence itself. Existence is part of the divine reality. Part of it reveals the divine reality, part of it conceals the divine reality. That too is part of the divine reality, the Tzimtzum itself. And our Aveda is to come to recognize the divine within it all, and Havayu Elikim. V'yadai tayim, v'shavesa levavecha, ki Havayu Elikim, b'shamayim emal v'aretz mitachas, ein oid. That Havaya is truly Elikim. Ein atzim master al atzim, like he brings in Vayadai to Moskva and Tafresh Nun Zayin, with a din actually. You can't put your hand on your head and serve as a yarmulke. Because because your hand is the same thing as your head. You need an outside garment, an outside thing. Here there's no outside thing because it's kedin kedein kamtza, so the levushe menei yobei. And with that he concludes chapter 21. A continuation of chapter 20, all to explain how all of existence is really divine. But it's our job is to come to discover that, to come to recognize that, and to come to integrate that in our consciousness. And when we do, then our independent consciousness, you say, it's not an independent consciousness. It's the way God created us that we should have that feeling of independence. That gufa comes from the divine power to conceal. So then even the very concealment is also a part of godliness. An example in Aveda would be, I think I mentioned this, but I'll mention it now. When the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested for Yud Beis Tammuz, and they asked him, they threatened him, they said to him, do you know where you are? They wanted to intimidate him. He says, yes, I'm in a place that's parted from a mezuzah. Like a stable. That itself, he was mamshech elikus. There are places where you see elikus, you put up a mezuzah. But there are places where it's parted from a mezuzah. That itself is Hashem saying, here, tzimtzum. Here, I don't want you to put a mezuzah. So he was being mamshech elikus even in a place like that. That's also part of elikus. So from this we come away with a deeper understanding of the existence in the context of Hashem Echad. No room for any iota of duality. So everything is ultimately part of Anochi Hashem Elokecha and Lo Yeh Lecha, which is the converse. There's nothing outside of God. And this will help us come back to understand how every mitzvah, not just Avodah Zarah, but every mitzvah is revealing this truth, the truth of the divine unity that's all pervasive and all encompassing. So with that we conclude Perek Chof Aleph. This class and all classes can be found at TanyaApplied.com. Everyone have a good Tavach, a good Nechede Shel, we could say already Aksiva V'Chsim Teva, a good Nemfreilichen, B'Teva Nira V'Anigla Chede Shel, for every Yid and alle Yidden, especially in Eretz Yisrael.
This has been My Life Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.